Hello, everyone. My name is Kayla, and I'm with Haunts Horrors and History. This will be my first video. I'm hoping to continue and make some more relating to the Haunts, Horrors, and History genre. So, paranormal events or haunted places, different spirits, whatever that might be. The horror genre, which involves things like I'm a huge Halloween fan. Most of my house is Halloween. It is year round. My wedding was Halloween. So I like to watch horror movies. So I've planned to, deep dive some videos in that area or, horror different themed things. Maybe do some, I don't know, maybe do some shopping hauls relating to Halloween because I do shop year round for Halloween. And then also talk about history, which I'm a huge history buff, so that might be many different things, whether it's World War II, World War One, which are two main areas I do a lot of research over, or also too, I figured that will also probably involve, murder mysteries or missing people, whatever that might be. But to give you a little bit of information who I am before I dive deep into the topic, since this is my first video. So my name is Kayla. I am with the Midwest Spookcast, which is a podcast. But right now that's on a pretty big hiatus simply because two people live more than is either 2 to 3 hours away, and the other two of us that live here just had kids and now they're turning one. I also have a 9-year-old, but we're so busy living life that it's hard to get all of us together at the same time. So I decided to kind of deep dive on my own and figure out how the logistics of that, figure out what I want to do simply because I don't know if people just want me sitting here chatting or maybe I can do things like press shirts. So do whatever it might be while I chat. But I figured my first one, I'm just gonna test the water, see what happens, and go from there. So the reason I decided to do this, I grew up in haunted places. I dealt with the paranormal. I do ghost hunting on the side. My family's pretty involved with it, having had many paranormal events in their lives, experiencing different things. I but the other side of that is I'm also a mental health therapist, and I also have a missing aunt that I never really got to know. So it's kind of put me into this weird interest of really wanting to know more about serial killers or those that have harmed other people, but even more so the psychopathology behind all of that. So my first video today deals with Herb Baumeister, which he was the owner of the Fox Hollow Farms. So I figured this would be my first video simply because I was so interested in why I didn't know much about him prior to the Hulu series relating to him. And I had actually found out about him. So I was at work. I work for an agency, and one of my coworkers was telling me how they watched this documentary over Herbert Baumeister and were surprised because they never heard of this person before. And they told me, more so asked me, have you heard of this person before too? And I was like, I have no idea who that is. I was really confused because I've heard of many serial killers, but I had not heard of Herbert Baumeister. And they encouraged me to go watch this documentary and talk to him about what I thought or what my feelings were towards it. So, this case that I'm going over today really started with me watching this docu-series and then deep diving further into it, and it still leaves me with so many questions. And I think my biggest question ultimately is who's still there? Because the victims do not get to tell their side. And it's heartbreaking because will we ever fully know who's all out there? Will we ever be able to, get answers for all that and to hopefully find closure for the families? And even too around some of the paranormal events around there, help find closure for the victims too. But to dive deep into it, I did write a script on it. I'll try and follow it to the most part. I had to write it simply to keep me on track as I can go off into a tangent. But I'm super excited to dive deep into this. I do want to place emphasis on that I will not talk about the victims in this video. I I think when it comes to the victims, they need their own video. They deserve their own light. They deserve their own moment. I Yes, they might have been murdered by this person, but I think they don't need to be associated in the same video with this person. That they deserve their moment to have their story told, to be explored about who they were, that their identity isn't victim. They are so much more than that. They were a person, and they still are a person. So, to dive deep into that, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit today about what human darkness looks like. So, that's an interesting topic for me because what makes a person evil? And I find this topic interesting because I follow behaviorism pretty heavily as a therapist, although I do follow into many different therapy modules and all that, but I've always been very fascinated by behaviorism, which teaches everything's learned. And it leaves me with the question, does evil truly exist, or are we simply products of our learned environment? Can we learn what evil is through our parents modeling it? Can we learn evil through our family showing us it? Or can we learn it through things like a traumatic brain injury or trauma at birth? And that's where it leads into the argument of what is nature versus nurture, which leaves me intrigued when evaluating the case of Herbert Baumeister. And the reason being, and I want to dive deep into that, is he was born on April 7th, 1947, so we're coming up almost, well, in about 22 years, 100 years since he was born. But he was born to an affluent family, which consisted of his father, which is Dr. Herbert Baumeister, and he was a renowned anesthesiologist, and then also his mother, Elizabeth Baumeister. Now, he was the eldest of 4 children, and there's a lot of theories around, birth order and all that fun jazz, especially around, Alfred Adler. But there's many different theorists that look at birth order and how that gets involved. And that's where I always get intrigued too. Does his birth order have something to do with what turned him into what he did? Which I highly doubt. But it just leaves me with so many questions over his placement too, and so many psychological things that get involved into his psychopathology. But it is notably remarkable that nothing noteworthy is really shared in Herb's childhood that would give, I guess, many of us reason to assume what would lead to his later murderous tendencies. I didn't see, traumatic birth injuries. I didn't see, brain injuries in his childhood. Didn't see that his parents, were abusive. It sounded like they were pretty atypical, I guess, quote unquote, normal parents. So that's where I'm really intrigued by that. But nonetheless. But later in his adolescent years, though, he began engaging in activities that were risque, they were immoral, they went against society's norms, and that included things like his fellow classmates of his reported that he peed on one teacher's desk, and on another occasion, he left a dead crow on another teacher's desk. He would play with dead animals, and he would exhibit antisocial behaviors. Now, Herb's father later had him hospitalized where a psychiatric evaluation was completed and the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder were given to Herb. Now, this is notable as schizophrenia in males is typically diagnosed in late teenage years to early 20s. I was really intrigued by this because I do work with schizophrenia. In fact, I really enjoy working with schizophrenia. It's one of the diagnoses that I feel pretty comfortable with, and I think it's one that a lot of people misunderstand it, and it's heartbreaking because so many of them are so kind and they're so thoughtful towards others, where they're so often misjudged over who they are and what they are. And when I was deep diving Herb's situation, I was curious because I didn't read anything up on him experiencing delusions, hallucinations, flat affect, some of the things that might be associated with schizophrenia. And that's where I was curious, where did this diagnosis come from? What led them to this? And of course, too, we have HIPAA and all these different things that, you can't really share. Things that happen to him in mental health care. But no one really shares those things either, too, when it comes to who he is and what he did. I mean, granted, people would share that he seemed different and that he was very antisocial. He, struggled with talking to people. I mean, in one situation, he had picked up a couple fellow college classmates. I think it was college classmates. And he picked them up in a hearse and he brought them to a game. And he acted quite strange, and that's where people oftentimes feel like he's very antisocial. Although he strived and desired connection with others, he went about it in a way that, wasn't the norm then, and it might not be described as the norm now either, too. I mean, I don't know, just a lot of interesting things. But now, the biggest thing that I do feel that there is the antisocial personality traits there, but I always question that schizophrenia part when it comes to him. Especially so because statistically, people with schizophrenia are more likely to be the victims of harm, not the perpetrators of harm. And that's where, granted, does that mean that Herb doesn't have schizophrenia? No, I don't know. I don't know him. It very well could be he had all the symptoms and I just couldn't read up on him. But, so, notably, interestingly as well, Herb reported that many friends along the way, he had shared with some of his close friends that he desired to taste urine. And that's where there are diagnoses in that realm that kind of look at that, some fixations and, whatever it might be. But of course, too, the biggest thing is we don't have additional information. I'd be curious, if we could dive deep on the roots, what exactly is the full picture of diagnosis, which diagnosis is a very small key factor in all of this. But regardless, if we had a better picture and if he would have got more help, could he have stopped the path that he was on? Because the reality is that from what I gather, there's only 2 cases where he got hospitalized. And so from both situations, I don't see that he was on medications. Doesn't sound like he received therapy services. Sounds like it was just these 2 hospitalizations and that was that. Which, if he did have schizophrenia, what we find is very beneficial for those with schizophrenia is that they have a longevity of services, which that can be psychotropic medication management, things like your atypical antipsychotics. They might be on antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, all sorts of different things, all depending on what they're looking at, because we also run into things like schizoaffective disorder. So the other side of that too is therapy, helping, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, whatever it might be to help manage, the onset of symptoms or management of current symptoms, or finding ways to learn new coping mechanisms too. And also be able to, be within society too in a way that they find productive. So, because as a therapist, I hate that we have to teach people to be normal. In fact, I think the greatest thing sometimes is that we help people just feel comfortable in their own skin and be able to be productive in their own ways. So, now, in Herb's early adult years, he had attended 2 years of education, first beginning with 1 semester at Indiana University, where he did end up dropping out, and then later attending a semester of education at Butler University. So, he did end up dropping out of Indiana University, but he did end up meeting his wife, Julie Sater, there while attending in 1965. They did end up getting married in 1971, and this marriage did result in 3 children. Now, the 3 children in question that were produced in this marriage, it was fascinating because the research I did, Julie had talked about how they only had intimacy from what she remembered 6 times. And it's fascinating to me because I do recognize that it only takes 1 time to create a child, but it's interesting that it only took 6 times for them to produce 3 children. And they only had sex that many times. And they were married for 25 years. So this leaves me with a lot of questions. And it's not that I'm offset by that, because I recognize some marriages do just fine with very little sex, where some do require more consistency. And the other side of that, too, is for Julie, that she reported she had never seen Herb naked. He always changed in the bathroom. But also, too, he was very anxious and would require the lights to be turned off. And 2 months after he was married to Julie, he was hospitalized. Well, it wasn't 2 months. It was shortly after they were wed that Herb was hospitalized for 2 months because he was hurting and needing help. So I do recognize that, especially because he was hospitalized for 2 months, there is a good chance he was dealing with a severe and persistent mental illness. And, why is it that those services weren't continued following his hospitalization? And granted, maybe there were, we just don't know about. But, I don't know, nonetheless, it's interesting to me. Whew, running out of air. I am dying slightly. But all right, we're going to move into Herb's adult life. So, although Herb is known for being the Fox Hollow owner and subsequent serial killer, it is now often hypothesized that Herb is also the perpetrator of the I-70 strangulations and murders. Now, between June 1980 and October 1991, many young boys and men were left strangulated and often either naked or near naked near rivers, ditches, and bodies of water that were central to the I-70 corridor. Um, the one thing that was interesting in my research of this was it is hypothesized that there's a couple different murders along the I-70, or I should say killers, along the I-70 corridor. But it's ironic that there is a potential for a couple because after Herb had purchased Fox Hollow Farms, these murders ended. So that leaves me with the question of, was this his beginnings of what he started doing? And it'll lead me, and I'll kind of discuss it later, some of my other hypotheses around his murders at the Fox Hollow Farms. So, again, ironic because the murders seem to have stopped around that time that he purchased Fox Hollow. Now, in May of 1988, Baumeister and his wife purchased the Fox Hollow estate, which is an 18-acre estate located in Westfield, Indiana. This purchase was from the resultant success of the Save-A-Lot thrift stores Baumeister and his wife opened in the 80s, which found substantial success. From what I'm finding online, the Save-A-Lot stores no longer exist. There is a type of store called a Save-A-Lot, but it is not associated with Baumeister or his wife. It actually sounds like they filed bankruptcy on them. Now, within this time, Baumeister often was found working extensively, while his wife and children, at home at most times, were often with Herb's mother at a lake property. So they did own a lake property. So Herb's wife and children were at the home quite a bit, but a lot of times they were also at this lake cabin. Now, in 1994, one of Herb's sons found a complete human skeleton partially buried on the property, which is interesting because Herb would try to he would try to hide this finding and claim that it was one of his father's anatomy skeletons. So take back and look at how Herb's father was an anesthesiologist. I'm a little concerned why his dad would have anatomy skeletons. Maybe doctors then, that's their side gig. They'd have anatomy skeletons just hanging out wherever. But I digress. But he did end up hiding it in a new location because Julie did get after him to hide it. She claimed that she believed him. She didn't really feel any suspicions towards this, and she's like, get rid of it, do whatever you need to do with it. But she did also recognize around this time too that a lot of why she feels she believed him is because their marriage was in shambles. She didn't really want to believe it was closer to failure than it already was. No. During the early 1990s, Indianapolis Police Department and the Marion County Sheriff's Department began investigating the disappearance of local gay men. So Indianapolis around that time was not known as a really safe district for the LGBTQ community. There was a population that existed there that would attend the various gay bars or clubs, but it wasn't known as a very safe place to be for the LGBTQ community then. So although many reports were submitted, the police departments did not take many reports seriously and often would share that these individuals simply vanished. So again, I go back to how this area was not typically safe for them. And this also was not a time... Oh, also, correction, it wasn't the 1990s. It was around the 1960s and 70s. And I actually take that back, because it wasn't the 60s. My math is completely off right now. It would have been in the 80s and early 90s, so I actually was right on that. Oof to golly. I think I need to go back to bed. But I think I need to continue this first and get my math on straight. So it was the early 90s. So, yeah, further on that. Kayla had a brain fart. So, again, they didn't take those reports very seriously. And because of the lack of assistance, two notable families of Roger Goodlett and Alan Broussard reached out to private investigator Virgil Vandegrift. Now, it's interesting because in the documentary, and then there's also a really, really good series on YouTube that explores this further, and they end up interviewing Vandegrift, and he does an awesome job talking about what his experience was and what his thoughts were and his struggles with the case, because he was quite frustrated that nothing had really been done. Now, with these revelations, Vandergriff and his team worked to collaborate with the gay community on building strong connections, obtaining information, and creating potential witnesses. Now, Vandergriff and his team were quick to discover over 12 missing gay men, which they were met with reluctance on them following through on investigations. So, a couple things that I can imagine. So, during that time, and even still to this day, family members struggle to talk about their family member being gay. They might have kicked their family member out, they might have disowned them, or they might not have even known their family member was gay. I mean, granted, a couple of the cases that were explored, their family knew they were gay and were accepting of them, but they still ended up going missing, which is very unfortunate. Now, Vandergriff eventually did catch a break in the case when he reached out to one of the known survivors, known as Mark Goodyear, and they do in both the Hulu series and the YouTube series, they do end up talking to Mark Goodyear, and there's a whole theory behind Mark Goodyear. I'm not going to explore that a ton, simply because I feel conflicted. I really don't know what I feel towards Mark Goodyear. Maybe I'll come back to it. So, Goodyear reported to Vandergriff that he had gone to Baumeister's home with him in the promise of getting to swim in an indoor pool and have consensual relations. Now, while there, Goodyear was strangulated by Baumeister and eventually went acting as if dead. Now, when Baumeister stopped, Goodyear awakened, and Baumeister was pretty shocked by this because he thought he was dead. So he did end up bringing Baumeister ended up bringing Goodyear home, and it had ended up warning him, don't tell anyone, no one's gonna believe you. But throughout that time, the relations continued between the two, where Goodyear reported Baumeister stalking him, his grandmother, and threatening him that the police would never believe him. So that's where I do end up struggling because, especially because Goodyear lived, did he feel threatened by Baumeister because he's a wealthy person? Did he feel threatened that because he's gay, the police wouldn't believe him because there were already missing gay people at that time? Did he feel like, no one's going to believe me in general? And he was already being stalked by him. He was being threatened by him. I don't like to blame the victims in these situations, because what if he felt so threatened that he kept the relationship between him and Baumeister to keep himself safe? I don't know. And that's only a theory that I have. But also, too, do I feel like he participated? In a way, yes. But again, I don't know. Now, another individual, Tony Harris, reached out to the police department reporting that a Brian Smart had killed his friend Roger Goodlet. Tony reported that Brian frequented the 501 Club, a gay club, and had obtained his driver's license information. Following this report, police notably discovered that this individual was actually Herb Baumeister. So Herb had used a couple fake identities to get people. But police confronted Baumeister and his wife, whom both turned away police requests to investigate their home. In June of 1996, Julie became frightened of her husband's erratic behaviors, filed for divorce, and allowed police to investigate. So during this search, the remains of 11 individuals were found, where only 8 were identified. And the sad part that I have to look at is they found 11. 8 were discovered. Their identity was. What about these other 2? But I do firmly feel there are many, many more than 11. And it's, to this day, people are still finding their remains, and they're still working to identify some of these remains. And that's why I think it's so important to keep this story alive, because if a person had a missing family, or even someone that's not from that area has a missing family member that's within this community, and they haven't talked to their family member in years, is there a possibility that they might be there? As sad as that might be, I think family members, when they lose a family member, search for, or at least just want answers. I know for my family, we would give anything to have answers on my aunt. I can imagine the same for other family members out there too. That although this is a horrible place and a horrible thing to think about, is there a way to get answers to for those that do remain, versus just hiding from it? Or just putting these remains in bags and forgetting about them, because they are people at the end of the day. Now, Goodyear later claimed in oopsie daisies. So Goodyear later claimed in a documentary that the news released that an ongoing investigation was happening at Baumeister's home. While Bauma, I apologize. I'm laughing because I keep stuttering. I need to get it together a little bit. And English today for me. While Baumeister was at Goodyear's home, so when it was released on the news that Baumeister was being investigated, he was at Goodyear's home. And Baumeister ended up fleeing to Ontario, where he later allegedly died by suicide. And it's interesting because prior to this, he had tried to flee with his son. And Julie ended up that's where I believe she ended up filing for the divorce, because she's like, we need to get him back. We need to get him in protective custody back home. And that's where Baumeister ended up fleeing to Canada in his car. And before he had stopped, though, or before he had died, he was stopped by a Canadian Mountie that had noticed in his car he had a box of video cassettes. And, at that point, she really didn't assume anything suspicious because, it's the 90s. People have video cassettes. It's not anything or videotapes. It really wasn't that strange of a thing. But the interesting side is the person that found Baumeister reported that he had not seen a gun, but reported that he was left in a position that he felt was not evident of suicide. And the person that found him actually has been interviewed multiple times, and he found it strange because the way that Baumeister was laying, it seemed like he was set up in that way. And he was very consistent in saying, I never seen a gun there. It seemed like his body had been moved there, from what I gather from this individual. And they struggle to this day with the decision by the police that he died by suicide. And even Goodyear had talked about in his interviews, too, that he felt he didn't die by suicide, that someone had done this to him as maybe as a way of revenge, whatever it might be. But the videotapes themselves that came into question were never found, too. Goodyear and a couple others kind of hypothesized he probably threw them out because it's assumed that a lot of these videotapes were Goodyear's way of keeping evidence. A lot of times we find with serial killers, they keep something about the murders, and it is believed that these videotapes were probably the evidence that Baumeister kept to remind him about these murders, and in order to keep himself safe, he had to get rid of them. Now, and before I get into the next part too, I take a deep sigh because this is such a tricky case. And we're left with so many answers. Baumeister did not serve his time. Did he work alone? I do not feel he worked alone. I feel with and especially too because it is claimed that Baumeister would strangle his victims after swimming in the pool with them. That he, would get them close to death and he would get off on this. It was how he would get pleasured, and he would bring them, supposedly would try and bring them back to have sexual relations with him. And that's where I go, did he take it too far on the first occasion, end up killing the person, and then now he's got this gratification out of this, not only the sexual gratification but also killing the person too. And that's with the amount of people too, and there were claims of parties there too that Baumeister would be involved with, that people would go missing at. So I feel pretty firm, and especially too with where the bodies were found, how did he carry them this far? I just, and how he got rid of them, I just feel there's no way he worked alone. And maybe he did, but I'm pretty firm, and I feel inside that he did not. I struggled with believing that he did work alone. And does that mean Goodyear worked with him? I don't know. Could it be a whole group of other people? Absolutely. But that's where will we ever have the full answer? Probably not, because not his ex-wife didn't even know what was going on, and when she did find out, she was in a state of shock. I mean, how would one person feel if they would find out that, I've been married to this person for 25 years, although that they were really strange and goofy? How could they do this? why did they do this where our home is at? I mean, I feel for Julie deeply, and I feel even much more so for one of the victims. Their sister worked for Herb and ended up working with him quite a few occasions and shared how he was strange. You know, he was very erratic, he was very bossy, and she lives with this regret that I worked for my brother's killer. And my heart breaks for so many of these people, and I think that's why I want to help be another piece of the puzzle that keeps this story alive, because I think we need to find more answers. We need to bring some closure to so many, because ultimately the 90s was 30 years ago, and we're still finding more. And hopefully we get answers before it's too late. But that's not the end of Fox Hollow Farm story, though, because following his death, the Fox Hollow Farms later resold to Vicky and Robert Graves. And during their time of owning and following Herb's death, many remains have been found and continue to be found. I mean, to this day, people will be out for walks, and it sounds like there must be like a lake that's nearby, or some type of body of water that's nearby that people will be by, and they'll end up finding small human remains. So it's still eerie that that's still going on. Now, the paranormal side of me recognizes that because of the number of deaths there is probably a good chance that this place is haunted. And there have been many hauntings reported. In fact, there's a whole investigation and a documentary over the hauntings that are on Fox Hollow Farms. Now, it is believed that there are many spirits there, especially the victims, but it is also believed that Baumeister is still there. And it is believed that he and his victims primarily haunt the pool room and in a separate apartment house on the property. Now, I found this to be interesting because Robert and Vicky, when they lived there, one of Robert's co-workers struggled to get to work on time all the time, so he ended up moving onto the property into this apartment. And while he lived there, he had multiple situations happen where on one occasion he had some really aggressive knocking happen, and his dog would freak out, and he said that his dog was a pretty gentle dog. And when he'd go answer the door, there was no one there. And on another occasion, I believe it started with knocking, and he ended up finding there was a person with a red shirt on that was way outside. And actually, no, he was out walking his dog. And when him and his dog were walking, they ended up seeing this person with a red shirt, and his dog took off for that person. And although this individual was pretty frightened, he was more worried about his dog and took off after his dog to save him. And they, of course, couldn't end up catching this person. But later on, he ended up opening up to Robert and Vicky about this. And both of them, Rob was pretty confused because he's like, it's probably just a person trespassing, because this is, a place where a lot of people were murdered. People are probably curious. And Vicky was pretty alarmed because she had also seen this person and had experienced many odd things. And I noticed on a couple occasions, too, that when her boys would be coming inside, when she'd be vacuuming up human remains. And I think the last situation I'll probably share, which I found to be probably the scariest one, was the individual that was staying in the apartment. He ended up hearing, I think it was knocking, and I could be wrong on that too, but he heard a noise and he ended up turning on his voice recorder to see if, whatever was there would talk to him. And it did end up talking back, and he'd ask, who are you? And it ended up responding, the married one. And in all the research they ended up doing, the only individual that was married was Herb Baumeister. So that's where it is believed that Herb is still there, and many of his victims are still there. And quite frankly, they report that the pool area is the most haunted of all of it. But the main thing I want to stress at the end of this video, though, too, is if you or someone a family member, whoever it might be, that has lost a male in the 80s or 90s in the surrounding area, I'm going to link some information below so that in case you are ready to contact these departments to try and get answers, or if you might have some answers too that might lead to, a person being found or further information about the Baumeister case, I'm going to link that information so that we can bring all these people back home, get them back to their family members or wherever is home for them. And I think the last thing I'll end on is my heart breaks in this situation. So many of those in the LGBTQ community have gone through some pretty significant harm and continue to do so. I mean, we look at so many cases where people were murdered, killed, raped, whatever it might be in the LGBTQ community, and their stories are still unheard to this day. And there's a lot of, when we push those harms away, they tend to get worse. They don't tend to get easier, because the more we know, the more we can help stop situations too. And we need to protect every individual. And my heart breaks even more too for the family members that, lost their family member to Herb Baumeister, and to his victims, of course, too, who were just living their life. And I recognize too, people might say, they were reckless. I have to look at people in their 20s, often younger too, maybe 30s, 40s. Sometimes we just make whim choices. And that's where I go, we can't blame the victims, but we can bring them home. And that's where I hope whoever watches this can help further find more answers and help us better understand two serial killers and the psychopathology behind it. Because the more that we understand, the more that we can stop it in its tracks, and hopefully stop future serial killers too. But, air down the wrong tube. But I appreciate those of you that are turning in to listen to this. I apologize that I don't have a ton of information here. This is my first video. Kind of just winging this to see what happens, to see if there's more interest. I really want to deep dive the victims or deep dive some more stories to share with you all. I'm welcome to any feedback that you guys have to improve the quality. I definitely recognize the video quality sucks. I'm working to improve on that. But outside of that, I think the next situation I plan to look at further, I really, really, really want to deep dive. I've been looking at a couple cases, but the primary one, actually, I'm going to pull it up here quick so I make sure I give the right name. So I think the next one I'm going to deep dive is actually Bobby Mackey's, which is actually a haunted location. It's a music bar in Kentucky. It's, oh gosh, I grew up watching A Haunting and many other series, and many of them deep dived Bobby Mackey's. And I actually had to laugh because when I brought this topic up to my podcast team to do for the podcast, all of them were like, what is this place? I have no clue what it is. And I was super excited because this was one of the ones I always found so interesting, because people have died there. Supposedly there's been exorcisms there, there's demons there, whatever it might be. But I don't know, I'm so intrigued by this location. I plan to deep dive that one because there's a really interesting case where it's believed that the daughter of, I think it was a gang member or the owner, that fell in love with this individual that ended up and she got pregnant by this individual and was beheaded by him. So, and supposedly her body's there, her head's there. Oh man, I'm so excited to deep dive that one because I'm so intrigued. I'm so intrigued by this situation. But again, thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully I have better quality next time, better lighting too. I'm just in my basement. It's very 70s, 80s. I just moved into it. But stay tuned and stay spooky. Take care, everyone.